Canton Confidential, the Karen Reed murder trial, starts right now.
The trial began in April, and 6 weeks later, the prosecution continues to call witnesses. Good evening, everyone. I'm J.C. Monahan. Glenn has the night off. Testimony picked back up today after multiple days off last week. So let's quickly recap who we heard from on the only day of court last week, which was Tuesday. The defense finished their cross-examination of ATF agent Brian Higgins, and then jurors heard from John O'Keefe's niece and nephew, who he had guardianship of. We heard from an emergency room doctor who treated John O'Keefe in the ER that morning, and the hospital's chief pathologist spoke about blood testing procedures, and then a forensic expert testified about Reed's blood alcohol level the morning John O'Keefe was found. Finally, there were two Canton Town employees, including the superintendent of public works, who spoke about the snow plowing that happened during the blizzard. Now, three more witnesses took the stand today, including a state police lieutenant whose team recovered pieces of broken taillight from the scene, and a pair of forensic scientists from the state police crime lab who examined evidence, including John O'Keefe's clothing. Our Kirsten Glavin has been covering this trial since the beginning. She's joining us live from Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham with more on today's testimony. Kirsten.
JC, another long day here, but new tonight, we're now getting a better sense of a potential timeline for this case. Outside of court, we heard from Reed's attorneys saying they hope to present their side of this case in exactly 2 weeks from today, adding that potential jury decisions might be made, deliberations, I suppose, starting the last week of June.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. Knight. Week 6 of testimony in the Karen Reed murder trial now underway, with Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara of the State Police Special Emergency Response Team taking the stand.
Because this was such a condensed search area, we just had the team members stand almost shoulder to shoulder as they searched through the area.
O'Hara describing how pieces of taillight were collected in the front yard of the Fairview home near where John O'Keefe's body was discovered.
This is one of the larger pieces, sir.
Including O'Keefe's sneaker.
So right here, this is the sneaker that we recovered.
Reed's defense team pushing back on where specifically the evidence was located, previously implying that it had been planted.
Were you aware that the scene was left open to the public for hours before you were asked to search?
I was not aware of that.
Next to testify, a forensic scientist at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab.
I performed blood screening on the lower lying areas of the undercarriage, on each side of the tire flap, as well as the edge of the bumper and the exhaust pipe.
DNA, pieces of glass, taillight, and more collected from Reed's SUV.
That is a picture of the apparent hair I noted in the area.
Reed's attorneys questioning how some pieces were loosely perched on the bumper after the vehicle was transported from Canton to Dighton and back in a blizzard.
According to your notes, the glass pieces that we're looking at on the back of this bumper would have traveled, let's call it for round figures, about 60 miles in a blizzard before you saw it.
I don't know when the glass pieces were ended up on the bumper, so I couldn't say.
Last to take the stand, another forensic scientist at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. A number of photos admitted as evidence.
I just received the debris that was already packaged. So it was labeled as coming from jeans, boxer shorts, sneakers, a gray long sleeve shirt, and an orange t-shirt.
Now, there is no court scheduled for tomorrow, but that forensic scientist you just heard from there will be back on the stand first thing Wednesday morning. JC.
Kirsten, thank you. We're joined now by local attorney Catherine Loftus, also known on TikTok for Note My Objection. Catherine, we had a day full of testimony about forensic evidence. Based on all of that, what was the big takeaway for you?
The big takeaway for me, JC, was I have no idea what happened. Really, it's interesting to me because the two things I think that were focused on were the hair that was retrieved by the criminalist from the state police lab, as well as the gray sweatshirt that John O'Keefe had. And what is shown to me that I'm coming up with more questions than answers on both ways, because the Commonwealth is basically stating that this piece of hair stayed on Karen Reed's vehicle from Dighton back to the Canton Police Department that it stayed on until the State Police Crime Lab
This
came.
is actually, if we can put our viewer question up, because this is actually what somebody wrote into us. We got a lot of emails over the weekend, and it says from Alan, how could there be broken glass on the bumper or apparent hair on the car when it was towed to the Canton Police Department in a blizzard, sat there for many months before anything was done to it? And you're touching upon that right now because one of the forensic scientists for the State Police Lab was talking about taking tweezers to pick out little pieces of glass, which means they couldn't have been buried deeply into that bumper if we're just taking little tweezers.
I actually had less of a question about the glass because, I'm thinking, and these weren't questions that were asked by the Commonwealth, which I thought would have solidified a little bit what their theory is. But the glass, I thought maybe it's cold, it's, it's January, they could be frozen. Then when they come back it's in the Sally Port, the snow is melting, things like that. The hair was a little bit more suspect to me because, listen, I don't know, I'm not an expert in how, deeply it has to be embedded in a taillight or things like that to stick. But I think the interesting thing is the alternative theory, really, which is the inference from the defense is that it's maybe planted somehow. I wonder, how do you plant a piece of hair on a vertical car and have that stick for 2 days before it's picked up with a pair of tweezers? And the Commonwealth didn't ask, was there any adhesive? Was there any glue? Because I don't think that's plausible either. So, like I said, I think that the evidence coming out is not really. It's not really showing anything. It's just leading me to have more questions than answers at this point, which is not favorable to the Commonwealth, I don't think.
Well, no, because we talked about this many times since you've been on, which is why aren't we getting more of the specifics? We still haven't had the medical examiner on, things like that. And you talked about the trajectory that a prosecution wants. They want to peak at a certain point. And you would think today, when we're seeing photo, clothes and car and tailpipe, or tail light, I should say, that this would be sort of as we're at the top of the hill. But
right. And I do think, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but the CERT team lieutenant who testified, I thought he was a peak and then we went back down. And that seems to be the projection of the case, is that when we go up on it high, we come back down, because it really, between the hair, the glass, the fact that there was no biological samples, so that leads me to believe that, there's no canine, but there's also no grease or anything like that from the car. So, what happened to John O'Keefe? I don't know.
I felt like we were walking away, like you said, more questions than answers. Right. We're going to talk more about the taillight. As you just heard, we've been getting a lot of great questions for our experts. So if you have one, send us an email at canton.confidential@nbcuni.com. We're going to answer another viewer question later this half hour. But first, we have a lot more to get to, including a deep dive into Karen Reed's broken taillight. The prosecution and defense have very different theories as to how it broke. We have that timeline when we come back.
Is it preferable to leave a crime scene unattended prior to searching it?
No, I think they would have searched it before we arrived, yes, sir.
Again, I'm going to ask if you would. Please just respond to
what my preference would be, sir, yes, I'd prefer that it was secured.
Okay. That wasn't very difficult.
Apologize on the objection, Your Honor.
So, no comments, Ms. Giannetti.
Well, that was State Police Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara testifying today. His team was the first to find pieces of taillight later in the day when John O'Keefe was found. Karen Reed's broken taillight is a key piece of evidence that could help make or break the case. So let's take a deeper dive based on what we've heard so far in court.
Prosecutors have accused Karen Reed of hitting John O'Keefe with her SUV outside 34 Fairview Road in Canton, and they say that led to the cracked taillight.
The victim, Mr. O'Keefe, with her car, knocking him back onto the ground, striking his head on the ground, causing the bleeding in his brain, swelling, and then leaving him there.
Prosecutors say investigations found pieces of Reed's taillight in front of the home. Pieces like this. But it's when those pieces were found that has the defense asking questions.
During that thorough search of Brian Albert's front lawn, the number of pieces of taillight that were found by a minimum of 4 officers looking for evidence was 0.
The defense has suggested investigators may have tampered with Reed's vehicle and planted pieces of her taillight at the scene. The prosecution says that's not true. Witnesses testified to seeing Reed's SUV in front of 34 Fairview around midnight, but no one reported seeing damage to Karen Reed's taillight.
around 12:45 in the morning, when the vehicle was in front of the residence on Fairview, that for some perceptible period of time, that vehicle travels over 60 feet in reverse at over approximately 24.2 miles per hour.
As officers started surveying the scene, no one reported seeing broken pieces of taillight. It was not until roughly 12 hours after investigators first arrived on the scene that the first pieces of taillight were found by the State Police Emergency Response Team. That was around 5:30 in the evening. According to police records, that's around the same time Karen Reed's SUV was seized by State Police Trooper Michael Proctor and towed to the Canton PD. Trooper Michael Proctor reportedly found multiple pieces of taillight at the scene in the days after O'Keefe's body was found. Canton's police chief had also spotted a piece himself later that week.
Chief Berkowitz brought my attention to a piece of red glass that was about 6 to 8 feet off the into the yard.
We also heard from two women who reportedly saw damage to Karen Reed's SUV. Jennifer McCabe and Kerry Roberts testified to being with Karen Reed during the search for O'Keefe that morning.
Karen was screaming and, saying that she had cracked her taillight.
At some point in the conversation, she said, "What about my taillight? What about my taillight?" And I looked, and there was a piece missing, but it was caked on with snow. You could tell there was a little black hole.
On cross-examination, Jennifer McCabe testified that she spoke with Trooper Proctor and mentioned the taillight the day of the incident.
And what you told Trooper Proctor that day was that you, quote, saw a crack in it, end quote, correct?
I told him that the taillight was cracked.
You see that photograph? You were shown this photograph on Friday. Does that look like the taillight has a crack in it?
It's cracked, yes.
It's actually completely missing.
Yeah. And I believe in one of the reports, one of the many reports, it will say that I said it was cracked and missing pieces.
The defense has another explanation of how the taillight became cracked.
You will see Karen back up her Lexus and strike John's car at about 5 a.m. when she was leaving John's house to go out to look for him. And you will know that she struck his car at 5 a.m. because you will watch that video closely.
So to be clear, we haven't seen that video yet because we're waiting for the defense to present its case. The state, of course, maintaining throughout the trial that Karen Reed did this and that she is not being framed. There's obviously a lot more to discuss here. We'll be joined by Sue O'Connell and Catherine Loftus when we come back. Welcome back. We are joined by Catherine Loftus and, of course, our courtroom insider, Sue O'Connell. Let's continue about the testimony about the broken taillight. There was a lot of detail about it, but from each vantage point, what do you feel like you learned?
I learned that there were a lot of pieces of taillight that have to be introduced individually by ADA Lally, and it takes a very long time to do. So for a good hour, we sat there listening to testimony that wasn't really testimony. It was more like an inventory management system. I don't know if you've ever had to do the overnight inventory at a retail place. I have, and it's not pleasant, and that's what it felt like. And I felt like it just muted any significance that all of this evidence had today, because it was really after Lieutenant O'Hara was up, again, we went back into the weeds and it was confusing. So,
Catherine, you just said when we last spoke to you that, the prosecution has the burden of having to do this, of having to walk step by step. But is there a way that you can make it a little more engaging and less like, that lecture in school where you start to tune out?
There is. And as I said before, the Commonwealth sometimes has the unfortunate burden of, making sure that they lay the proper foundation, that the evidence comes in, that it comes in compliance with the rules of evidence. So they're also fighting another battle that really the jurors and the public aren't seeing, really the legal battle that they have to comply and they're making a record. But I think that the way, as we've discussed before, that the Commonwealth, there's just sort of a monotonous to it. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of inflection. It's hard for the jury,
even just vocally,
because you can make really boring things interesting if you put a little bit of jazz behind it. And so I think the fact that there's just when we hear from the Commonwealth, it's hard to know as the listener, there's no inflection up and down. What's important, what's not. And as an attorney, as somebody who's tried a lot of cases, I think that's a really big part of what's missing, and it's tough.
We talked about the acoustics because that has become a thing. It's a lot of Judge Cannone saying, could you please speak up, and that the court reporter needs to be able to write all of this down, and we're going to have to turn the AC off. Is it as tough to hear in the
terrible.
courtroom?
It's worse. It's worse because we also, I mean, the witnesses, they're doing the best they can, right? So it's sort of, I mean, JC, you know, when we host an event or we moderate a panel, it's up to us, right, the professionals, to bring the energy up, to make the guests feel comfortable, to get the conversation going. And what the problem is with ADA Lally's approach is that he's not doing that. So if he's mumbling, and when he's looking at a piece of paper, talks like this, and then you can't hear him, the witness isn't going to take that cue, and the witness isn't going to respond.
They're not going to match the energy.
Exactly. So when, Alan Jackson got up today and said to the witness, I didn't mean to be yelling at you, and I don't usually talk like this, but I don't want, you didn't say it, but I don't want the AC to go on again. And, and everyone just went, okay. And then that witness, that was Maureen Harnett, who wasn't like super soft-spoken, but then she became more animated so that we could hear. So we've got the threat of the air conditioning being shut off. You've got the threat to ADA Lally that he's not speaking up. And then the poor witnesses who are also being not really admonished, but urged to speak up.
Right, of course. I mean, but can we also talk about a lot of evidence went in? We saw a lot of photos, things that I would find emotional in seeing John O'Keefe's last outfit and the rips and what stains were on there and such. But it also found like, wow, it really took any momentum out because we had to enter one and then a pause and there's a break and then did it feel that way in court? And is there any other way to do it so it doesn't sort of take the air out of the balloon, so to speak?
Unfortunately, when it comes to evidence being admitted into court, there's a lot of, monotony, and it is boring. And I've been talking about this on my page for a long time, that when we get to the experts, when we get to some of the really detailed stuff, it is kind of, you have to go through, it's methodical, and sometimes there's not really a way around that outside of personality. And so when you have boring evidence, you have stuff where you're going to, the jurors are going to get a little bit more tired, the viewers are going to get a little more tired. You have to put a little bit of spin to it, and I think that's a big part of what's lacking from the
But to your point, though, we saw John O'Keefe's last outfit that he was dead in. He died in that outfit, and you had to see
right there.
The family's right there, and you had to see that the shirt was cut open, which we heard the testimony from the EMTs in the ambulance that they had to do that on the CPR to resuscitate him. Right. That's a terrible thing, and not to be like all cold-blooded and objective here, but that would have been an opportunity for Lally to humanize the evidence that the jury was seeing.
That's what I meant by I was thinking of it that way, but it still was very clinical, and so I was still trying to take notes. All right, don't go anywhere. We have so much more to follow in the trial. Our website is the best tool to keep track of it. Head to NBC10Boston.com, click on the Karen Reed tab, and there you'll see all of our nightly recaps. You can get details on where to find the free live stream of the trial, including our YouTube page. Stay right there. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Sue and Catherine. Back with us here. We literally just got another viewer question. Yes, this is from Kathy, and it's a very straightforward one. Why wouldn't the Commonwealth put their lead investigator, who is Massachusetts State Police Officer Michael Proctor, why isn't that the first person on the stand?
Do you want to take that?
So I think probably he's not the first person on the stand because he's the worst witness, most likely, for the Commonwealth. So I wouldn't have necessarily led with him. But there's been a lot of speculation kind of outside that he's not going to be called. I have not come to that conclusion yet until the end of the Commonwealth's case, because the defense ultimately is going to call him. It is what it is. It's going to come in one way or the other, whether the Commonwealth calls him, whether the defense calls him. So
I didn't even finish. I apologize to Kathy. The end of it was because it makes me feel like he's done something wrong.
Right. Well, in their opening remarks, in their opening statement, Yannetti said that there are things that they're alleging that Proctor did, which I think are going to be very disturbing when they are said in the courtroom. And if Alan Jackson is the person doing cross, I can just imagine what we're going to have to bleep off of our broadcast on any stand in the trial. So he's a problematic witness. And again, he's had problematic witnesses and he's had Lally has and the Commonwealth has had witnesses that don't necessarily add anything that they bring on. I can't imagine they can't figure out a way to have him on that actually is helpful.
And do you think the jury, we're running out of time here, do they even pick up on this? The Proctor name keeps getting thrown around, but...
Yeah, they've heard Proctor more, I think, more than any other name in the trial.
Okay.
Right. So if you don't call him, that leaves the question to the jury. From my perspective, if he's bad, he's bad. You just have to take it head on and try to remedy it as best as you can.
Right. As always.
Yeah, because if he shows up as a defense witness, it's going to be worse.
That's where I was anticipating this is going to go. All right. Thank you, everybody. Again, if you have a question for our experts, send it to us in email at canton.confidential@nbcuni.com. Of course, we'll be here every night for you at 7 o'clock. There is no court tomorrow. Doesn't matter. We'll be here, and hopefully you will as well. And then testimony picks up once again on Wednesday.